Okay, we continue in the Gemara in our discussion of the generation of the flood, what led to their degenerate behavior, which of course leads for lessons for us. Kuf Chesed Amud Aleph 108a, and the line begins with the word Rabbi Yossi Omar. Rabbi Yossi says, a little bit higher than halfway from the bottom of the page. Now, yesterday we said that the reason why they degenerated into negative behavior is because of the overabundance of blessing that God gave them, and because they were spoiled, essentially, and they didn't acknowledge the provider of all that goodness. They quickly came to the conclusion, what do we need this God for? And they started behaving degenerately. And therefore God says, they are using my abundance against me, so I'm going to give them abundance in a negative way, in that they said, what do we need from God? Just a drop of rain? We don't need that. We have rivers and springs. So the destruction was exactly that. Too much rain, overabundance of rain, and overabundance of rivers and wells. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking perhaps the suggestion, and of course the floor is open, that maybe the curse of the flood is that they were flooded with too much wealth to the point that they, metaphorically drown in it. I mean, obviously the story of the flood is literal, but maybe what we can derive from that is this notion that sometimes the blessing becomes so much that we kind of drowned in it, and forgetting the provider, and it just leads to our own detriment, our own destruction. Okay, so in a similar vein, Rabbi Yossi says, Doir HaMabon, the generation of the flood, loinus go, in a similar but different vein, they didn't become haughty in their ways, elabishvil gagla ayin, only because of the eyeball. Shedoima lamayim, the eyeball is similar to water, presumably in that the eyeball itself is wet, has moisture on it. Now, actually, Rashi says that they're compared to water, in that it's the eye is a small place from which lots of water can emerge when a person cries. So that, in the same way, a well is a small place from which a lot of water emerges. The eye is also a small place from which a lot of lust can happen, which is kind of what he's saying here. So, the people of the flood only became haughty because of the eyeball, which is similar to water. Essentially, they took women as they pleased. In other words, their eye constantly looking out for lust and looking out for how could they increase their pleasure is what led them astray. Like the famous line goes, "Ha'ayin roya," the eye sees, "Va'lev chomed," and the heart desires. And we say every morning in our prayer, "Al taveinu de'in hasayin," don't bring me to a test, which means we're asking Hashem not to put us in a situation where we're tested by temptation of sin. So if it starts in the eye, then one should not bring oneself to temptation by making sure that what they're looking at is the right stuff, and not say, I'm only looking, and then when the temptation comes, I'll control myself. Not a good idea. If it's something that is likely to lead to temptation, keep your eyes away from it. And therefore, lefichach, they were judged. Lefichach, if they were judged, Oisan, God judged them. B'mayim, with water, shedem l'gagal ayin, which is like the eye. And as I mentioned from Rashi before, it's like the eye because the eye is a small place, and water emerges from a small place, a well or a spring. As the verse reads, Nikvu kol ma'yan, all the springs of the bow, the depth of the earth, time rab of the great depth of the earth, all came forward. And the basins of the heavens opened up and the water poured down. I'm describing the flood. Okay. Omar Berchen says, generation of the Mabel, similar vein, Berabba Kilkalu, they messed up with abundance, with the word Rabba, with the word great, or with abundance, but specifically the word Rabba, great. Uberabba Nidainu, and if they were judged with the word Rabba, with the word great. In explaining what he means, says the Gemara, Berabba Kilkalu, where is the verse which implies or informs us that they messed up with Rabba, with the word great? Shneimar, as the verse reads, Vayar Hashem, God saw ki Rabba ras ha'adam. Great is the evil of man. God saw that the great was evil of man, and therefore he decided to destroy them. Ki Rabba ras ha'adam ba'aretz. And then we have the verse which reads Berabba, with great, Nidonu, they were judged. Remember, the verse reads, Kol Mayanas Time Rabba, all the wells of the great depth, again invoking this word Rabba. So literally it would seem like Rabbi Yochanan is making a reference to the word Rabba, which appears both in their negative behavior and in the destruction, but perhaps it's leading forward to this idea of Rabba as in abundance or greatness. In their own great and grand style of living is what led to their degeneration, which thus led to the destruction itself, coming forth from greatness, from overabundance, too much water. Even though water, tempered in the right amount, is the source of blessing, source of life. Right? When they're searching on Mars to find life, they're looking for water, because water is the source of life. But too much, and there's the curse, there's the destruction. Omar Rabbi Yochanan says, Shloisha, there are three of the wells, or three of the wells, not the rivers, the wells, the springs, I'm sorry. Three of the springs that opened up from the earth at the time of the flood, Nishtayra Mehem, were left behind and still exist till today. Namely, Balua de Geder, that's one, Chame Tveria, the hot waters of Tveria, Ve'ena Rapsi de Biram, and the great pool of water in Biram. So there's three places that still have these springs. The hot springs in Tveria is something you can still visit today. I've been there, it's quite interesting. And Rabbi Yochanan says that these remain from that time, that flood. The floor is open to interpreting what the spiritual messaging of this is. What does it mean? Why is it important to know? And why three specifically? And why these three? Floor is open as to what the spiritual significance of this is. But of course, the literal meaning of the Gemara remains literal, and that these three wells are still there, or these three springs are still there from the time of the flood. Now the verse reads, Ki ishchis kol basar daikar al aretz. For man destroyed all of his ways on the earth. This is a description of the generation of the flood. Amar Rabbi Yochanan comments, Melamed, this teaches us, Sher biu behema al chaya, they made an animal, a domesticated animal, behema, copulate with chaya, with undomesticated animals. The chaya al behema, and undomesticated animals, chaya on domesticated animals on behema. Ba'kol ala adam, and all of these animals copulated with man, but adam ala kol, and man copulated with all of them. So there was cross intimacy between all species, which of course in Torah law is from the highest levels of sin, is this idea of intimacy being abused in this cross kind of relationship. Never mind between humans and animals, but even amongst animals, one is forbidden to create crossbreeding between species. And that was the ultimate sin that they were engaged in at the time of the flood. One of the spiritual ideas of this is the idea of crossing borders. Sacredness, holiness is created by borders. When you think of the Mishnah cites, there are 10 levels of holiness, Israel, Jerusalem, and then levels going higher and higher, closer and closer to the Holy of Holies, the highest being the Holy of Holies itself. And in each level of holiness, the holiness is defined by boundaries and borders of who may or may not enter. So finally, at the Holy of Holies, where only one Jew goes in once a year. And the same thing is true of the holiness we experience on holy days, Shabbat, holidays, Yom Kippur. All these things are defined by things we should not do, things we don't do. They're borders. The borders is what keeps the thing inside in a sacred space, by putting borders and parameters as to where it should and shouldn't go. And the same thing is true of our intimacy, as we talked about here many times, the importance of having borders and saying no at times and to certain types of behavior, so that it remains, the inside say, so that what we have remains sacred and pure. And this kind of cross breeding and cross copulation, cross intimacy, is the ultimate breaking down of the borders and saying nothing is sacred, all is for sale, nothing is valuable, nothing is important. And unfortunately, till today, such a culture still prevails in some places in the West Coast, perhaps. Making reference, of course, to Hollywood and that kind of culture in which, oh, it's no big deal, it's just a body. What's the big deal? Trying to break down all the borders and saying nothing is sacred. Now, obviously, it hasn't gotten as far, I hope, as it was at the time of the flood, but the idea of breaking down these boundaries as a negative, and that it's important that we maintain these sacred borders and boundaries so that we maintain a sense of purity in what we have, in the intimacy that we do have. And Amar Rab Abba Bar Kana, Rab Abba son of Kana says, V'kulam, all the animals, Chazru, went, after the flood, all the animals went back to proper intimacy only within species and not cross species. Chutzmi Tush Lame, I'm not sure I pronounced this word, but it's a certain bird that apparently copulates with, or has intimacy with any species. So there's still one bird that maintains its negative behavior. So it's interesting that Rabbi Yochanan before said that there are 3 of the springs that opened up at the time of the flood that still remain till this very day. And here we have another comment in that there's still one bird that has negative behavior in like the pre-flood. So both something of the punishment of the flood remains, 3 of these wells, 3 of these springs, as well as some of the negative behavior still prevails, at least in one species, in this one bird. Now the verse reads, God said to Noah, Kates called Basar Balafanai, the end, or the disgust, Kates of all flesh came before me. Amar Bechanan, this verse kind of indicates, that all the flesh, not just humans, but all flesh became disgusting by God, and that there was this negative behavior between species and not just the human race that became degenerate. Further commenting on the misbehavior of the generation of the flood. Now, after considering the kind of what kind of society it must have been, where the boundaries of intimacy have completely been stripped, and that all cross species, humans and animals with humans, and all kinds of animals with each other, and all of that still doesn't warrant the flood until we get to the next line. This is unbelievable. Amar Bechner says, Bo'orei, come and see, Kama Godel Koicha Shel Chamas, how great is the destructive force of thievery, stealing. Shahidara Mabel, for the generation of the Mabel, says Rabbi Yochanan, Avru Alakol, they transgressed everything, they broke down every barrier. But V'loi Nichtam, Aleim Gzardinam, their fate had not been sealed in the destruction that came to the flood, until they extended their hand in thievery. So degenerate behavior with regard to intimacy, God's not destroying the people yet. Stealing, now there's the destruction. It teaches us the great value, the great importance of treating other people's property with respect. In some way, not in all regards, but in certain regards, it has a certain element that's even worse than breaking down the boundaries of intimacy. It's quite something. One could make the argument that when it comes to intimacy, I don't even know if I want to say this, but I'm just putting it out there. I don't know if I'm fully set on this idea, but perhaps, and I've opened this to you to think about, with the breaking down the boundaries of intimacy, at least there's, it doesn't make a mention of rape. So maybe there is a consent, and therefore, even if we have no regard for the sacredness of intimacy, at least we still regard the other person as an independent being. But then once you once there's thievery, once we introduce thievery, now there's no regard for the other person's opinion or feelings. How much more so if we were to get to, God forbid, rape, in which there's completely no regard for the other person. But once a person crosses that line where the other person's property doesn't become valuable, so now the other person's opinion or consent is a matter of no consequence. It's almost like that's the last barrier that's being pulled down. And when that happens, this is when God decides he's going to destroy the world. And therefore, the verse says, the verse reads, and Rabbi cites a verse to prove this idea. For the earth was filled with chamas, which can be translated a few ways, but here the Talmud is translating it to mean thievery. Mitpneim, from before them, and therefore he says, God, therefore now I'm destroying the earth. And the verse reads, and this is a verse in Yecheskel, in Ezekiel. It's Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 11. I'm going to read it in the English from Art Scroll here. Violence has arisen. This is the word used, the translation of the word chamas. Here it's used as violence, but as mentioned before, the Talmud translated it here as thievery. So let's just use thievery. Thievery has arisen to become a rod of wickedness. There is not amongst them, nor among their multitude, nor among their offspring, anyone among them who yearns for me, referring to Hashem. But the literal reading in Hebrew is Lo mahem v'lo mahamoinam v'lo mahamehem. None of them are worth it. None of what they have are worth it, and none of what their offsprings are worth it. As if to say, they're not worth living, because there's thievery, because there's chamas. And therefore, Omar Belezer says, Malamed, this verse teaches you, Shazakav Asmikamakal, thievery itself, as an idea, stood up before God like a rod. Right? This verse reads, Hachamas come, that the violence arisen. So the literal meaning is that people became violent. But if we take the word chamas to mean thievery, and we take the word come, arisen, to be literal, so we say literally, violence itself, thievery itself as an idea, stood up before God and said, stands before God and says, the Father, and says before him, the Master of the universe, none of them, and none of their of what they have, and none of their offspring, and none of them themselves are worthy. Meaning to say, it's all with thievery. There's no reason for this society to exist, and this is what stands up before God and says, seal their fate. And this is indeed what seals their fate for the flood. Quite a powerful lesson on respecting other people's property. Okay, one more line. Says the Gemara, even Noah himself, his fate was sealed to be part of the destruction. As the verse reads, V'loi noch bahem. So it's a play on the words in the verse. The concluding line of the verse in Ezekiel is V'loi no bahem, which, as we translated literally here, was, and there's no one amongst you who yearn for me, meaning who seek out Hashem. They're all seeking out their selfish pursuits to the point that they have no respect for other people's property. But if we change the hay into like a ches, make it noyach, v'loi noch bahem, or loy noyach bahem, as Noach himself doesn't either deserve to be amongst them, or deserve to live on, as it were. But Hashem changed his mind, obviously, because Noach found favor. As the Gemara continues, to Rabbi Shmuel, we've been taught in the household of Rabbi Shmuel, in the study house of Rabbi Shmuel, Afal Noach niftach Gzar Din, even on Noah, the fate was sealed that he should be destroyed as well. But he found favor in God's eyes. As the verse reads, God says, I regret that I created them in the plural, all of humanity. And then, and the verse reads, and Noah found favor, as if to say that the fact that Noah found favor only comes after God's decision, implying that the destruction of Noah was part of that original decision. And perhaps the reason is, there's a famous Zohar which says that there were 3 people who faced destruction near them, and there were levels in which they reacted. Noah was one level. He was told by God that the entire world was going to be destroyed, and God told him to build an ark, and it took him all this long time to build the ark, and the point of why it took so long was that people should watch, and people would ask him, why are you building this? So he could say people are behaving degenerately, and therefore come onto the ark and get saved, or change your ways and God will spare you. Not come onto the ark. Ark was only allowed for those who behave properly. But says the Zohar, Noah failed to some degree because he didn't actively go out to try to help his fellow man. He just did what he had to, hoping that people would react and join him. And of course he was unsuccessful. Nobody reacted. Then you have Abraham, who was faced with the city of Sodom. We mentioned a few days ago in the Mishnah, which we'll discuss later in the Gemara. People of Sodom were set for destruction, and Abraham negotiates with God in trying to spare them. But the way in which Abraham negotiates is by saying, please, if you find 50 people who are righteous, save the people on their behalf. And God says there are no 50. And then he says, what if you found 40? What if you found 30? What if you found 20? All to say, he says the Zohar, that Abraham is defending only the righteous and hoping to save others on behalf of the righteous. It's another level in which, more than Noah, who just was passive waiting for people to react, Abraham actively tried to defend, but only on behalf of righteous. And then there is Moshe Rabbeinu. 2 weeks ago, last week's Parsha, where the Jews sin with the golden calf, Moshe stands up to Hashem to defend even the greatest sin, even the sinners. And that, says the Zohar, that's the ultimate true leader. The one who's willing not just to defend, not just to be passive and hope other people listen, I'm okay, I'm saved. If someone wants to join me, fantastic. For sure not. And not only like Avraham, who says, let me gather in the righteous and hopefully it'll help others, but like Moshe Rabbeinu, who himself stands up to God to defend the sinners themselves. And perhaps this is why, on the one hand, Noah's fate was sealed. Why aren't you defending others? Why aren't you trying to encourage others to join you? But at the end of the day, we cannot. So there is this thought, as it were, in God's mind that Noah also should be destroyed. But at the end of the day, the idea that because he himself is righteous, he found favor in God's eyes, he was therefore, at the end, spared. Okay. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody. Have a peaceful Shabbos. Have a safe Shabbos. Take the time on Shabbos. Spend time with your family. Have words of Torah already printed out before Shabbos to share with your family. And may we all reach the day when the whole world will be Yom Shekulei Shabbos, the day which is all Shabbos, the coming of Mashiach. May it happen speedily in our days. And we hope everybody's healthy and everybody's safe. And have a peaceful and wonderful Shabbos.